Hi everyone, my name is Karl Greathouse. Today I'm going to be talking about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, its history, its impact on various parties, from investors to companies to foreign countries, and some proposed updates to the act that some people have been calling for. So in 1977, the SEC ended an investigation into bribing of foreign officials and other corrupt practices that corporations have been participating in abroad. And it's important to note that U.S. corporations actually cooperated quite well with this investigation, and many of them volunteered information on what they'd spent in bribing foreign officials. Just because obviously corporations don't want to have to spend this money bribing foreign officials, and it's not really fair. They've all lost out on business deals because somebody else paid a bribe. And so, just to create a more fair and level playing field abroad, corporations were very cooperative in this investigation. But what the SEC found here was that American corporations had spent millions and millions of dollars in bribing foreign officials. And in response, Congress created the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Now, the act does two main things. First, the act outright bans bribing and other similar practices abroad. Second, the act implements some accounting provisions. We'll get into those a little more later. But the act applies to all American citizens, anybody within U.S. borders, all American-based companies, and any foreign company that trades stock within the U.S. So, as far as impacts of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, obviously this was passed quite a while ago, but it really has had some long-lasting impacts. So, first, on foreign countries, it's managed to reduce bribery, or at least slow its growth in many countries, especially countries where at the time of that the act was passed, or since then, the U.S. has become a major trading partner with these countries. It really makes it hard for foreign officials to ask for bribes when the only people that it can ask will be hit with huge fines if they do. And so it's managed to reduce corruption in some of these countries. By no means has it eliminated corruption, especially in countries where the U.S. isn't the only major trading partner with that company, with that country, which is a lot of countries. And it's actually made U.S. companies a lot less competitive in many countries. This makes sense just because if foreign officials require bribes in order to get business recognition or be able to set up a business in a country, then obviously businesses that don't have to comply with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and are able to bribe the officials are going to be able to get that preferential treatment and be able to set up their businesses in that country, and it'll kind of block the U.S. companies out of that country. But it has provided some benefits to the U.S. companies, because in countries where the U.S. is a major trading partner, it's created a much more fair and level playing field, and it's allowed more companies to get into the country and the country as a whole to develop better as well. And the last party that it's really affected is American investors, especially morally conscious American investors. At the time, there really wasn't a great way for investors to know if they were indirectly supporting these unethical activities. But now, with the provisions of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, they can have a reasonable assurance that more likely than not, these companies are engaging in business abroad in ethical ways, or at least not bribing foreign officials. So, the accounting provisions of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So there's two main provisions with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The first provision has to do with record keeping. It requires that companies make and keep records that are sufficiently detailed that the SEC can look back and see that there hasn't been any of these activities, especially with keeping records on the disposition of the company's assets. The second provision has had a lot more of a lasting effect on American companies, and it has to do with establishing a system of internal controls. So again, this isn't only American companies, it's American companies and companies that are foreign companies but trade stock within the US. And so these internal controls were set up with 4 main functions. And obviously each company is going to do these a little differently, but the 4 goals are: first, to ensure that management authorizes transactions. And this just makes management accountable when something does happen. There shouldn't be any transactions going on where some member of management hadn't authorized that transaction, or at least given a person power to make that transaction. The second internal goal of the internal controls was to make sure that transactions are properly recorded. And this just helps prevent cover-ups. Obviously, if you can bribe somebody and then just not record the disposition of that asset, whether it was cash or a fancy car, whatever it was, then it makes it much easier to cover it up. But if these internal controls are ensuring that all transactions are recorded properly, then that's going to be recorded, and the SEC is going to be able to look back at that and identify that. The third function of the internal controls is to make sure that only management authorized personnel have access to the assets in order to be able to engage in these corrupt practices. And that just ensures that there's not people going around engaging in this that management wouldn't know to look into. And the fourth and final goal of these internal controls that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act requires to be put in place is that audits are to be conducted regularly, just making sure from an internal perspective of the company that they can catch any unethical behavior within the company. And obviously this is not just foreign unethical practices. This could be embezzlement, any sort of fraud within the company, and is really one of the ways that this act has had long-term impact in the U.S., even outside of foreign corrupt practices. So recent developments with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, I guess now these aren't necessarily too recent, really since the turn of the century, so the last 20 years or so. But the SEC has been prosecuting much more since the turn of the century. Before the turn of the century, the SEC and the Department of Justice weren't prosecuting these cases all that much. They were, on average, about 3 cases per year between the two government organizations. Since the turn of the century, though, that number's increased drastically. It peaked in 2010 when there was 74 cases that the SEC and the Department of Justice prosecuted for violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And there's substantial debate onto the motivations or reasons for this increase. Some people say that it's because the SEC can get more revenue out of this, and so they've just been going after it because the provisions of the act are fairly vague, which prevents loopholes, companies from exploiting loopholes. But the SEC then can obviously kind of take payments that in previous years may have just been considered grease payments or gifts, which are allowed under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and then it can prosecute for those as bribes. And so some other potential reasons for increases have been there's been a substantial increase in the SEC's budget. The SEC has set up a specialized team dealing just with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And then there's also been an increased number of multinational companies. So obviously you have more companies, you're going to see more of this just because there's more potential people that can commit these crimes. And then the last reason is we've seen more international companies trading stock within the U.S. And a lot of these international companies haven't had the 40 years to get used to this act that American companies have. And so they see a higher rate of violations of this act. So some people argue that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act should be altered and that the specific prohibitions in the first part of the act should be made more concrete, like the accounting provisions. This, like I said, creates issues, though, where companies can then exploit loopholes. There's lots of ways to engage in unscrupulous behavior. And so, personally, I'm in favor of keeping the act fairly vague and allowing the SEC to prosecute. That way, when companies find new ways to be unethical abroad, we don't have to create a new law for it. They can't get away with it. They just are able to be prosecuted like they were before. And really, it's up to the companies. Like, the companies have the responsibility of ensuring that their behavior is ethical abroad, regardless of whether there's an act or not, especially in today's day and age of triple bottom lines and other practices that have made corporations as a whole much more ethically minded and much more responsive to shareholder and stakeholder demands for being more ethical. But this is actually a trend that corporations have been taking. They've been taking steps to make sure that they're within compliance of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Deloitte's actually reported that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act consulting part of their consulting division is a major source of revenue for them. So that is something that American corporations have been doing and probably will continue to do, because it's not likely that this act is going to change substantially, and it's not likely that the SEC or the Department of Justice are going to lay off and quit prosecuting these violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email.